ونزعنا من كل أمة شهيدا فقلنا هاتوا برهانكم فعلموا أن الحق لله وضل عنهم ما كانوا يفترون إن قارون كان من قوم موسى فبغى عليهم وآتيناه من الكنوز ما إن مفاتحه لتنوء بالعصبة أولي القوة إذ قال له قومه لا تفرح إن الله لا يحب الفرحين وابتغ فيما آتاك الله الدار الآخرة ولا تنس نصيبك من الدنيا وأحسن كما أحسن الله إليك ولا تبغ الفساد في الأرض إن الله لا يحب المفسدين. Translation. And we will bring forth a witness from every faith community and ask the polytheists, show us your proof. Then they will come to know that the truth is with Allah alone, and whatever gods they fabricated will fail them. Indeed, Korah was from the people of Moses, but he behaved arrogantly towards them. We had granted him such treasures that even their keys would burden a group of strong men. Some of his people advised them, do not be prideful, surely Allah does not like the prideful. Rather seek the reward of the hereafter by means of what Allah has granted you, without forgetting your share of this world, and be good to others as Allah has been good to you. Do not seek to spread corruption in the land, for Allah certainly does not like hypocrites.
I don't need to mic up with this, do I? No, it doesn't work, right? It's fine. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah alladhi hadana lihadha wa ma kunna linahtadiya lawla an hadana Allah. Laqad ja'at rusulu rabbina bil haqq wa salawatullah ala an-nabi habibi qulubina wa tabibi nufusina وحبيب قلوبنا الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه ومن تبعهم إلى يوم الدين أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. So I understand it's proper exam time / well no, actually it's breaking up time, right? Because everybody's going back home. So if you're from abroad, you're going back home, or if you're from another part of the country, you're going back home. How are you all? Yeah. That's fine. Am I not loud enough? Or am I loud? Oh, right. Okay, cool. That's fine. I thought I was. I'm a little bit loud. But, alhamdulillah, how are you all?
Good.
MashaAllah. Good. You guys enjoying the slightly warmer weather? It's definitely better than what it was 2 weeks ago, right? Yeah. Alhamdulillah, that's good. So I guess we'll probably make today's session a bit more of a discussion, just because everybody's sitting so close. Not that you're all patronizing, but it's just a little bit more like cozy. So how have you guys found the content so far, the course so far? You guys benefited? Yeah. So obviously a lot of information. And today, really, the discussion is, I think, quite topical. And despite many of us being, or some of us being international students, we have either spent a few years in the West, or we are going to spend the next few years in the West, or some of us may never return to our host countries and may just end up settling in the West. And definitely Sheffield's a nice place to settle, if anybody is thinking about settling in Sheffield. So therefore, a lot of the discussion, or the large bulk of the discussion today, is going to be about the West, right? Whether it's the United States or the UK or Canada or France, etc. And what we're going to be talking about is migration Just to get a little bit of a survey about where people are from. Where are people from? Just shout out some nations. From Afghanistan? Oh, mashallah. Right, mashallah, good. Sorry, somebody else said something else. Okay, Pakistan, good. India? Indonesia, brilliant. Anywhere else? Nigeria, good. France, okay. Right, wow. Born and bred in France? Born in France, but bred here, as in like, cool. Okay, so we're going to talk about France, but as well as other nations today. So all of us come from different parts of the world. I come from India, as I mentioned in the first session, but my parents were born in Burma, Myanmar. So I've never been to India, but I've been to Burma plenty of times. Unfortunately, it's a bit hard to get in there now, but historically. So these are probably some pictures that may be familiar to you. I'll talk about the first one slightly later, but does anybody know what movie this is from?
West is West.
I think it's West is West. It's the follow-up to East is East, right? So this is West is West, a comedy that people from the subcontinent have generally watched, which didn't do anything good for any form of racial stereotyping, unfortunately. Did all bad things. And of course, this is the EDL, the English Defence League, right? And does anybody know the name of this chap? Tommy Robinson, right? And, oh, that's interesting. Oh, right, okay. Makes sense now. Oh. I'm sure I opened it. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Assalamu alaikum. We just started, so okay, that's better. Right, okay, that's not working. Might need to do this for the whole lecture, who knows? I hope not. Right, okay. So we obviously all come from various different parts of the Muslim world originally, or may not originally come from different parts of the Muslim world. And I think we generally, when we go back home, we stick out like sore thumbs, right? Apparently, we walk differently, which is what my cousins told me back in Burma. Apparently, we walk differently. So apparently, I wouldn't demonstrate, but apparently people back home walk with a wider gait, so their legs are a little bit further spread out. I guess it's because of the mountains and the different hills, etc. And apparently, we walk a little bit more narrower. I don't know, this is not me saying it, this is my relative saying it. We obviously speak a little bit different as well. So obviously you've got the person who's born back home but speaks with a proper British accent, speaks, for example, Hindi or Urdu with a proper British accent, right? I'm not going to do an impression, but if you watch videos of Bilal Bhutto as an example, who's one of the party heads, you will see what that sounds like. Or some of us, we might replace words, right? So as an example, for those people from a subcontinent background, what's a plate in Urdu? Thali. Yeah, that's actually that's not bad. So, I learned something today, right? I'll just be plate, right? And obviously that does not cut it, regardless of where you come from. Right? So whenever we go back home, we definitely stick out like sore thumbs. That's probably the point. Because over the years, we've acclimatized to a very different culture, to very different tastes, right? And the reality is, whether we feel it or not, and I think it's probably a realization, I guess even when we're here as Muslims, and even as minorities, or however you see it, racially or religiously, we kind of stick out like sore thumbs too. Right? Does anybody disagree with that? I think it's fair to say that we do stick out like sore thumbs, right? Whether it's our culture, whether it's our food, right? Whether it's our food. I mean, I always get very annoyed when I see, somebody from, eating chapati with a knife and fork. It's hurtful, right? So whether it's our food, whether it's our language, and whether it's even our religion, our deen, in terms of Islam, and our value system, right? Very, very different. That brings about, now, what I want to firstly talk about is why we made the move in the first place. Why did we, or why did our parents and grandparents decide to move from the Muslim world to the West? Because if I was ever to meet, Inshallah in Jannah, but if I was to meet my great-great-great-grandfather and told him that, what do you think about, you know, if your ancestors moved from, you know, India to the UK? And he'd probably look at me like, what the hell are you talking about, right? Because for people, that was something that was unprecedented. It's not necessarily that migration was unprecedented, because Muslims come from a heritage where migration is pretty normal, right? For example, when you look at, for instance, how the West looks at migration, you know, they're stealing our jobs, they're doing this, they're doing that, etc., to, for example, some of the attitudes historically of people moving to the Muslim world, right? Or areas of, you know, people that were subject to warfare or war moving to other places, the attitudes were very different. It was pretty normal in the Muslim world to just cross a border. Well, there weren't any borders, right? But you could just go from one place to another. Which is why even the scholars of Islam, they had studied in various different parts of the world. They didn't need to pass through migration services, right? Or show a passport. They could just walk. So the attitudes were very, very different. So we're going to start off by looking at what the motivations of our ancestors were to come to the West, to the UK as an example. And then we're going to start looking at what challenges that brought, and what challenges existed for them, and what challenges currently exist for us now. And then we're going to look at, you know, paving the way forward for Muslims as minorities in the West, inshallah. So some of the motivating factors behind why Muslims moved in the first place include the following. So poverty, right? You know, generally and genuinely, a lot of our ancestors didn't have much wealth. So there were real economic reasons as to why they had to leave their family, leave their land of origin, leave everything that they knew to come to the West, right? Were there any other kind of motivating factors that may have led, or that led to our ancestors coming to the UK, for example?
Invitation.
Invitation?
From, say, Britain inviting Indians and Pakistanis to work in the NHS and other sectors, or Germany inviting Turks.
Absolutely, right? So invitation, right? So, you know, there was a need in a particular sector of the economy. So, for example, for a lot of the Muslims that came to the UK, it was largely to do with manufacturing, textiles as an example, you know, and the results of that are places like Sheffield, Bradford, Huddersfield, Halifax, and even, for example, East London, Canary Wharf as an example, and Newham, and Walthamstow. So, sorry, you were saying? Yeah. And Oldham, yeah. Sorry, everybody's getting very territorial because everybody wants me to mention their names. Any other motivating factors?
Lack of war, where
Yeah?
people were endangered, or like maybe their region was very hostile.
Yes, absolutely. War, right? So recently, for example, a lot of the Iraqis, people from Iraq, right, and Afghanistan, right, have obviously, you know, come from very difficult circumstances, you know, to the UK, not really wanting to leave us for any reason aside from the fact that they were in warring places. Any other reasons?
Maybe they just didn't like. There was like disease in the land. Maybe they just didn't like the standard of living.
Yeah, standard of infrastructure, lack of development, right? People had problems that they needed solving and they just weren't being solved, right? So even simple things that we take for granted, like paved roads, right? I mean, Sheffield doesn't have many of those, yeah, but, you know, but in other places, no, I'm only joking, Sheffield does. It does, right? But, you know, paved roads, right? Things like that, right? You can't take for granted. So people never had basic necessities being met.
The people came to study and through one event or another ended up settling here.
Yeah, education. So some people have come to the country for education, as an example, and made the decision to settle here. So there's multiple factors. So corruption is another one. People wanted to flee the corruption that was present in their lands. Family, right? They wanted to provide for their family, right? Or they may have some family that settled here. Infrastructure, lack of infrastructural development. Values, as an example, people were just sick and tired of some of the things that were happening in their lands, and they came in pursuit of a higher standard of values, right? Education, so education was one factor, and war, as you've explained, right? So these are just some images of, how migration kind of looked throughout recent history. This is probably 1950s, 1960s till now, right? So this is Empire Windrush. So this was the first ever kind of consolidated migration from the Caribbean to the UK, right? So you had a lot of people from the Caribbean to the UK. A lot of the patients that I inquire are from like an Afro-Caribbean or Caribbean background. So I always generally ask them, what their experiences are like. I talk a lot with them, to be honest. It's supposed to be a 10-minute appointment, it never really is, right? So, and then they just tell me, some of their experiences. Of course, there's, we'll talk about it later. There's obviously a changing workforce, right? The NHS workforce, a lot of the nurses that I historically kind of worked with were from the Philippines, right? And that's the reality of the workforce. So, this is a textile mill back in the day, right? And maybe some of our aunties, mothers, grandmothers may have worked in some of these textile mills, right? To make some money for the family, as an example. Car washes, these are some of the various different experiences, right? The problem is that this leads to a number of problems in our countries, Our countries are generally brain-drained societies. Any expertise that's created within our nations is exported to the UK. And genuinely, I remember my uncle coming from the US. This is when I was very small. And he was like speaking to my mum. And he was like, you're lucky that you're in Britain. And my mum was like, why? And he was like, Britain is like heaven on earth. Right? This is, probably early 2000s, right? But that was genuinely the attitude of many, many migrant communities, right? The situation in Britain is so much better, or the situation in France, or the situation in Canada, or the situation in the US is so much better than the situation back home, is generally the consensus. But here's the flip side to it, right? And it would be nice to get your views on some of these different things, right? Or not the flip side to it, actually, before we get to that. So what has the presence of Muslims in the West led to, right? So let's look at that. So we've been here for about 50 years, more than that, 50, 60 years as an example. So these are some of the outputs that have, resulted from that. Does anybody know who this is? Omar something. Ilhan Omar. So who's Ilhan Omar?
Didn't she get ousted recently?
Politician in America.
Correct. She is a politician in America, right? So she's quite a senior politician in America, right? And generally, she was one of the few, I think one of 5 Muslim politicians in America, right? Don't quote me on that, I think there might be more. So that's Ilhan Omar. So you've now got, for example, a sister in hijab in Parliament, in Congress, right? Halal meat, right? We can cook the dishes of our choices in the UK. Halal meat is very, very commonly available, right? You'll be given a halal option when you travel from one place to another on an aircraft carrier, as an example, right? Even Subway is halal, right? So, this is something that the Muslim community has obtained. Does anybody know what that is? Do you know which masjid it is? Yes, it's Grand Mosque. It's Sheffield Grand Mosque, right? I just typed in big mosque Sheffield and this is what came up. Right. So this is the Grand Mosque. So Muslims have built masajid, right? They've got masajid in a lot of places. Does anybody know what this is?
Prince William giving an OBE probably.
Yes, this is Prince William giving an OBE to this Imam. Does anybody know who this Imam is?
Is he from ELM?
Yes, he was with ELM. He was with East London Mosque, but he was, does anybody, well, there was an incident that happened in London where somebody ran in, so it was in Ramadan, and somebody drove a car into the congregation that was leaving a masjid in Finsbury Park, and of course, they got him out of the car and they all wanted to beat him up, but the Imam stepped in and said, look, we're not gonna, stop, don't try and beat him up basically, let the law deal with him, essentially, right? Don't know what different people might have different thoughts about that. But anyway, he was given an OBE when it came to that. So, you've got an Imam who's wearing, traditional clothing, accepting an OBE. Who's this? Sadiq Khan, right? So he was the MP for Tooting, which is where I went to medical school in South London. So we used to see him a lot, right? He's now the mayor of London. So, for many people, for Muslims, they may feel that they've achieved a lot. Who's this? Rishi Rich, right? Rishi Rich. So this is Rishi Sunak. And, you may not see it from a Muslim point of view, but you may see it from an ethnic minority point of view, right? That this is like a brown prime minister, he's got back at the colonialists, whatever you want to, say it as, right? But he's now the PM in the UK. But contrast this to some of these things, right? Does anybody know what this is? Charlie Hebdo, right? Which was when cartoons depicting Muhammad Sallallahu were written or were created, right? And it led to an incident, right? Which is something to be condemned. However, it led to a tightening of a number of different policies within France, which we'll talk about shortly. Does anybody know what this is? Yeah, so this is the grooming scandal, right? So this is the grooming gang scandal. And as a result of it, the Muslims have had a number of different repercussions, politically speaking. Who's this? Suella Braverman, right? Who recently came out, well, before she was obviously deposed, or disposed. She obviously came out recently, talking about the lack of policing of the Palestinian protests, or the pro-Palestinian protests, and equating some of the chants and some of the activism with anti-Semitism. Does anybody know what this article is about? Yeah, Operation Trojan Horse, right? Which we'll talk about later, but essentially it was a forged, fabricated letter that was randomly sent to Birmingham City Council and became the basis of an investigation and a number of policies which now Ofsted adopts concerning faith schools, particularly Muslim faith schools. I'm sure everybody knows about this. Right? Yeah, it's interesting. One of my colleagues in practice was like, I had to go to some Prevent training. Do you know about Prevent? And I said, well, I'm Muslim, obviously I know about Prevent. Right? But yeah, so Prevent, right? Prevent has a number of repercussions, certainly for students, certainly for professionals, certainly for a number of people. This?
The 8 countries.
Yes. So does anybody remember the Muslim ban that was in the USA? Right? So it was banning certain, people from certain countries from even traveling to the USA, right? Which was overturned, right? However, it obviously is in the context of a rising anti-Muslim sentiment. And guess who's back, right? David Cameron, right?
So the Muslim ban, am I correct in thinking, wasn't it the list from Obama's presidency, like the list he made when he was president?
Correct.
And Trump enforced it?
Yes, yeah, but it was Trump. So you've got David Cameron as well. So David Cameron is now back, but David Cameron really changed a lot when it came to the experience of Muslims within the UK. So you've got, the Halal meat and Sadiq Khan and etc., which may be seen as victories, but you've got a lot of these things that define us. And I haven't mentioned all of them. For example, I haven't mentioned outside of the UK. war on terror as an example, right? Which may not affect us, but affects our family. You know, the prevent duty as an example was the case study that the Chinese government used for its detention camps in, you know, with the Uyghurs, right? So there's a lot more to this. So in summary, migration was an opportunity, or was seen as an opportunity for Muslims to escape their socio-economic reality, because they desired progress, right? They wanted to improve their situation. They wanted to escape the corruption. They wanted to have greater wealth. They wanted to support their families back home, etc. And actually, when you speak to, or when I speak to my relatives, I can't speak for your relatives, but certainly my dad's plan was, I'm going to spend a bit of time here and then after that, probably go back. Does anybody else have that same experience? Right? But obviously that didn't happen, right? Because that's why we're here. So it was intended to be a stopgap, but Muslims stayed beyond this. And this is probably what I want to focus on in terms of why they stayed beyond this. And I think if we understand that, we will also appreciate the reasons why Muslims, certainly I hold, that Muslims are generally and genuinely having a tough time in the West. So the latest census is that Muslims constitute 6.5% of the UK population, right? You know, which is a growing number. So there was a backdrop to migration. And the backdrop was that the colonial powers, which we spoke about in a few sessions previously, were forced to let their colonies go, right? America entered, and, you know, not from an altruistic way, not that, you know, we love for people to have independence. It was, we need to express our colonial, you know, enterprise and interests in a different way. So it turned from physical colonization to economic and ideological colonization, which we'll talk about in the next session post-exam break. And for the West, there was a need for the economic workforce, right? So there was a need for a larger workforce. For instance, post-wartime, there were a lot of women that went into work, for example. And actually, British men weren't happy with that, right? They might not tell you that now, but, you know, historically, they weren't happy with that. So part of the migration was to get men and women across so that they can both work in textile mills, right? And, you know, do some of the jobs that they don't want to do, right? Or they don't want to do. And as a result, we largely settled in inner city areas and in industrial centres like East London, Sheffield, Bradford, inner city Leeds, Manchester, etc., etc. But I want to take us back to when the first ever Muslim community that migrated to the West, right? The first ever Muslim community. And the reason why I'm going to mention this is because that Muslim community, you'll be able to see, functioned very differently to how we function today as a Muslim community, as a minority living in the West. Does anybody know who this guy is? William Quilliam, right? Has anybody heard of William Quilliam before?
I've seen his mosque or the building that was
Yeah.
in Liverpool.
Absolutely. So there's a biography about him, William Quilliam, which you can purchase from anywhere, to be honest. I can't remember who the author is, but it's really good. And, you know, he created what is known to be the first ever Muslim community within Britain. So Quilliam was from Liverpool. He was actually from a, you know, upper middle class background. He was a lawyer by trade, right? He was pretty wealthy because what he used to do a lot of pro bono work. He used to do a lot of work for free for people who couldn't afford a lawyer and had problems when it came to, you know, their property, their work, etc., right? And because he was quite wealthy, he didn't really need to work that much. So he traveled the Muslim world. And he traveled the Muslim world and he experienced Muslims and he experienced Islam and he actually became Muslim, right, whilst he traveled. And contrary to how it is now, you know, the majority of the wealth in the UK was in the north, right? Obviously now it's in the south, but it was in the north before. So Liverpool was one of the richest places in the UK, right? Bradford was the fourth richest place in the UK, fourth richest city in the UK, right? Yeah, everybody's smiling, yeah, but it's true. Bradford was, yeah, and you can see that, by the way, if you ever travel to Bradford, which I recommend you do, because There's nice food there, and there's nice people, and also there's, World Heritage sites there as well, like Soter and etc. I'm not working for them, don't worry. You'll see the buildings, the old mills. They're very nicely crafted, right? Because there was a lot of wealth there. So William travelled, or Mr. Quilliam travelled to the Muslim world and then became Muslim. And he didn't just become Muslim, actually. He really became Muslim with a capital M, right? Because what he experienced in the UK was a number of different problems, right? So he lived during the Industrial Revolution, so he could see that the wealth gap between the rich and the poor was increasing exponentially. Poor people were getting perpetually poorer, and rich people were getting perpetually richer. And by the way, he was from the richer class, right? So he obviously felt that. He felt that that struggle resonated with, the struggle for, bettering the fellow human being that's within Islam, right? And essentially he called for kind of the rights for the working class, and he did that through spreading Islam, right? And he created the first ever masjid, which you can visit in Liverpool today, right? The Abdullah Quilliam Mosque. So he purchased property, or he had property, and then he actually converted it to a masjid, right? And I don't know how you can see that, but that's actually a picture of the masjid, the first ever masjid, right? In the UK. And he became an activist for Islam, right? Amongst the people of Liverpool. So he had food banks, as an example, similar to how you have today. He organized congregations. He was the khatib. He was a trained scholar. He was a trained Islamic scholar, right? And he was so kind of influential within his society. He became the focus of a lot of UK domestic policy, right? Because during that time, the British were at war with the Ottomans, right? Because of World War I. And instead of saying that, to the Muslims in Liverpool that we need to support the British and we need to join the army, etc., he actually attached his allegiance to the Ottomans because he felt that the best representation of his identity, of him being Muslim, was the fact that it was to be Ottoman, right? Because they were the, quote unquote, the Islamic Caliphate at that time, right? So he was very, very critical of British foreign policy, and he would stand on the minbar, white British man, and he would criticize British foreign policy in the Muslim world, right? And it was sad what happened to him because there was an entire media campaign against him, right? There was a massive media campaign against the Ottomans anyway, to be honest. So this is a depiction of the Ottoman Sultan. They were called the sick man of Europe. And to be honest, they were in a decline at that time. And Abdullah Quilliam was actually driven out. He was driven out of Liverpool. He was driven out by the people, not the Muslims, but the actual wider society of Liverpool. But he was so influential, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who was the Ottoman caliph just before he was driven out, called him the Sheikh al-Islam of the British Isles, right? Because he was the representation of Islam within Britain at that time. So he was driven out and he actually had to change his name and he settled in Woking. Does anybody know where Woking is? Yeah, so it's kind of southwest London, just after a place called Guildford. And he established the second masjid, right? Which is still standing today. I think it's called Shah Jalal Masjid. And he's buried there. But no one knew that he was the Abdullah Quilliam until after he died, right? But he repeated the same thing. He contributed and established a second Muslim community, but on the other side of the...
Which Muslims were in England at that time?
No Muslims were in England at that time, right?
So you said he was giving khutbahs and stuff. Who was he giving?
To reverts.
Oh, right.
Yeah. He reverted, right? He gave da'wah like nobody's given da'wah. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of people. But, that became his life, right? Because he could see the struggles of the average man and he was an advocate for Islam. And he felt Islam could build a sense of community amongst Muslims, right? And actually help to alleviate a lot of the mental and physical struggles that people had. He established waqf or awqaf, right? So, he contributed to, and he got other people to contribute to services that Muslims could actively, delve into, as an example. within Liverpool, including food banks, showering facilities, like simple things as an example. And he created a very thriving Muslim community. I'd definitely recommend you guys read about him, right? There's a lot available. And the reason why I'm mentioning him is because he was a model for, and he still remains a model for me and for many Muslims. He was very, very clear on his identity. He was very, very clear on his Islam. He built a community that was very independent from central government, and he built a community that maintained its own ethics, despite the ethics of the political system being very different. In other words, he criticized British policy. He didn't support Britain because he saw that the war that they were fighting in India, in the mutiny, and in Turkey was unjust. But that was the Muslim community then. And I want to talk about how things are now, right? And I'm not saying some of these things are bad things, but whilst Abdullah Quilliam and his community were very, very clear on their identity as being Muslims and carried it very, very proudly, things are very, very different, right? So this is a bridal dress, right? This is a bridal dress. And, traditionally speaking, bridal dresses certainly in my culture is red. My wife is a wedding photographer. And she tells me that, it's not in fashion anymore, right? I remember when I was getting married to my wife and my mum stipulated that she had to wear a red dress, right? That was like the condition of the walima, somewhat, right? It's like a matter of pride, right? Or like cultural identity. But it's very different now, right? A white dress is absolutely normal. Allegiances are sometimes split. This is a match between England and Pakistan, right? Who do you support, right? Is it England or is it Pakistan, right? You don't necessarily need to answer that question, right? Although I can hear people whispering Pakistan. This is Asian afternoon tea, right? This is Asian afternoon tea. I don't know where it's from, but, sorry? Yeah, apparently, my wife went to something like this and she told me that there's a place in Manchester that does this, but I don't know, right? I actually prefer traditional afternoon tea. It's a bit nicer. But yeah, I don't know, man, it looks a bit messy, as having afternoon tea. Yeah, absolutely, but anyway, this is how you have a blend in culture. Our weddings are different, right? You've got, for example, my parents, before, in a wedding, if you had a white guest, it would be like the biggest thing ever. It's like, why is there a white person at your wedding, right? Now it's pretty normal, right? Now it's pretty normal. You've got here Sadiq Khan, who is Muslim, right? I'm not saying he's not a Muslim, but what he's definitely doing here is a little bit questionable, right? From an Islamic point of view. You've got, for example, hijab, and you've got the contrasting, right, of how hijab is portrayed. You've got hijab worn by, does anybody know who this is? Shamima Begum, right? So you've got niqab and hijab, etc., worn by her. That's depicted in a particular way. And then you've got hijab worn by this person. Does anybody know who she is?
Emma Watson.
No, she's not Emma Watson. I can't remember her name, to be honest, but I know she's very famous. But she's now a brand ambassador for L'Oreal, right? For L'Oreal Paris. So there's a couple of, so contrasting Abdullah Quilliam and the first Muslim community to a number of different questions. How far or how much can we make Islam British, right? There's clearly a loss of language and loss of culture, right? Just look at many of our generations. I'm really trying to teach my son, Urdu, which is our language, but that's going to be tough, right? I'm trying to teach him Arabic, Urdu and everything, right? And I think he just looks at me blank, but inshallah that will change one day. What is the meaning of hijab, right? Where do our political allegiances lie, right? So there is very much a very different understanding of what our identity is. So what did Muslims come in search of and did they achieve it? how do Muslims identify today? Where do we lie with respect to Islam and the West? And how do we map our political future? Right? So we're going to start off with, why did Muslims come in the first place? Right? We know some of the peripheral reasons, but what is it that they were seeking? And I really want to portray what they're seeking. And actually, this will explain not only our experiences in the West, but our experiences throughout the world. So here are two pictures. Here are two pictures, right? Picture A and picture B. Can anybody tell me what the difference might be between both pictures? What are some of the differences?
Q.
A queue, right? So this is a picture from an airport in the Muslim world, and this is a picture in Manchester Airport, right? That makes sense. Right, why does it make sense?
The Manchester Airport, just there's queues everywhere.
Good, true, there's queues everywhere. But who likes a queue?
The British.
Yeah, it's not just the British though. The British love a queue, definitely, right? But queues are pretty standard in most of the Western world. But what does a queue tell you about a people and a culture?
Manners.
Organized, sorry? Manners, right? It's true. So, anything else? Civilized, right? Regimented.
Sheep. Sheep.
Cheap.
Sheep.
Sheep.
Usually when you see a lion, you just
Yeah, well,
form.
that's a bit harsh, but yeah. But regimented, organized, right? You know, have a bit of, sense of organization about them. But when you look at the queues in the Muslim world, it's a very, very different reality, right? I'm sure everybody, those people who are from, the Muslim world, when they go back, right? You're like, you're queuing up in Heathrow Airport or Manchester Airport, and you're giving your boarding pass in and you're going in. The minute you come out of the airport in your country, whether it's Egypt, whether it's like Pakistan, it's like every man for itself. Like you've got trolleys, you've got you've got trolleys crashing into trolleys, you've got people like throwing luggage, you've got an old woman that's in front of you, but no one cares. Like it's just topple her over and then you kind of carry on. But that is the experience, right? I mean, obviously I've exaggerated there, but that is the experience. But it's very telling about the differences in culture and organization, right? Because the lack of queue and organization is very telling of the way the society runs. And the actual existence of queues and systems and organization tells you about the way a society is run, right? And really what Muslims were seeking is progress and civilization, right? Is civilization. What Muslims have always been seeking is civilization. That includes organization. That includes having your problems dealt with, right? That includes problem solving. That includes having systems in place so that your voice can be heard. That includes, getting things fixed. That includes all of these different things. All of these different things are absent in the Muslim world. I'm sure nobody's going to disagree with that, right? We come from lands which are genuinely very disorganized, right? We come from lands where it's very difficult to get a problem solved, right? Think about, for example, somebody that lives in the Muslim world that's got a problem with their property. It's going to take like 3 years for that to be sorted, right? Maybe not that long, right? But it's going to take a long time to be sorted, right? But let's say, for example, in the UK, right, you have a problem with tax or something, I don't know. You just call HMRC, or, you go to like CAB, Citizen Advice Bureau, or you speak to your local council, and it takes long, right? But it doesn't take as long as the Muslim world, right? Think about, for instance, organizations. You guys will start to work in organizations when you guys graduate, etc., etc. You might be working for companies, right? Companies have policies, they have safeguarding policies, they have, for example, policies when it comes to working hours and limits on working hours. You know, when you, for example, when you're sick, you have to come back to work, and there's a whole return to work meeting. You have annual leave. You have all of these different things. We take it for granted, but there's actually a system in place, right? It's quite a rigid, regimental system, but it works, right? It works. It organizes the workforce, right? But that's definitely not the case back home, right? So when Muslims came to the UK, or when Muslims came to France, when Muslims came to Germany, when Muslims came to the USA, right? They were in search of a productive civilization, right? The sad thing is that our heritage or our history was full of a productive civilization. But through colonialism, and even a fault of our own, as we've discussed in the previous weeks, we lost that. So when we lost that, we really fell into a situation of decadence. And then we thought, right, okay, now we need some form of progress. Now, civilization, and this is where the issue happened, because when our forefathers, our grandparents and our parents came to the West, they looked at the material benefits that the West can give them without realizing that this, organization and progress and problem solving and all of these different things, they don't just come out of thin air. They actually come as a result of ideas, of thoughts, of a culture, right? The Western culture is a culture, right? Just like the Islamic culture is a culture, right? Just like communist culture is a culture. And because we were looking at the superficialities, we actually, underestimated the challenge that was actually at hand, which explains the problems that we came to, right? So a civilization is built up of two things, right? And this is a key point. A civilization, or what you see, is built up of a culture, right? Which is the ideas upon which that civilization is brought to life, and is also made up of something called urbanization, which is the material fruits of those ideas that you see, right? For example, we spoke about last time, the Western Bloc and the Eastern Bloc, right? The Western Bloc advocated freedom, whilst the Eastern Bloc advocated equality. Everything in Western societies is about, freedom. It's about maximizing freedom, right? For example, when it's economic exchange, you've got the stock exchange, right? You've got markets, you've got, online trading platform, because a man should be free to trade however he or she wishes, right? When it comes to, for example, the Communist Bloc, their society was an expression of equality, right? So if you wanted to own property, you couldn't, right? Because the state owned absolutely everything, right? So you had the pursuit of, the urbanization was a reflection of that culture. The modern world, or the West, was made up of these various different aspects that constitute its culture, right? The West has a particular culture. Religion and state are to be separated. Nation states are better than pan-national empires. So your national identity is the most important thing to you. Religion has no place in the day-to-day life of a human being, right? In Western culture. Individualism is the bedrock of society. So your pursuits, your ethics, your morality is decided by you, right? It's not decided by any supreme authority, right? And minorities are best represented in democratic governance. If you want your voice to be heard, then you have to partake within the democratic system, right? Everybody following my point? Yeah? This constitutes the West. And all of this was unfortunately overlooked when our forefathers, our grandparents, came to the West. And because this was, I'm not blaming them, by the way, yeah? Because they were a different generation, right? And I'll come to that. But because these things were overlooked at that time, it's led to a number of problems that we will come across now. Does anybody know what these are pictures of?
Dubai.
All right, so that's Dubai, yeah? So that's the palm. Does anybody know what this is?
Atlantis.
Nah, sorry?
Atlantis.
Nope. That's the pearl, right, in Qatar. So it's the same thing. Does anybody know what this is?
Kuwait.
No? That's actually Pakistan. Do you know what it is?
It's not Islamabad, is it?
Nah, it's Lahore. But it's a barrier town. Right? Yeah. So if you're from Egypt, like for example, Rihab. Is anybody from Egypt? I don't know. But anyway, there's a place in Egypt just outside Cairo which is called Al-Rihab. So it's the reason why I put these up is that, okay, somebody could say that, this productive civilization is also present in the Gulf, right? It's present in, for example, Dubai, it's present in Qatar, it's present in, different parts of the Muslim world, etc. But does anybody have any family that lives out in the Middle East? Okay, fine. So I've got family that live out in the Middle East, right? But there's a couple of things that happen with people who live in the Middle East, right? So you can work there, you can live there as long as you work, right? You're never really going to get citizenship, right? And everybody tends to come back whenever their kids are like school age, right? And genuinely, I've been to Qatar, it's a nice place, etc., alhamdulillah. But genuinely, when I spoke about if you have a problem and you need it dealing with and it takes a long time, it takes a long time, right? So you can't get problem solved, right? There's no problem solving, right? There's no urgency, right? We're actually used to urgency, right? When you have a problem, you want to get it sorted straight away. The mechanisms are in place, etc., etc. Can you imagine your mobile phone network is down and you call the company and the company says, Habibi, it's going to take 10 days, right? And you're like, damn, man. I went to Hajj last year, right? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. It was the most arduous process ever, right? Arduous process ever. You've got, billions of dollars, right? The Saudi economy, right? Worth trillions of dollars. And you know that there's going to be 2.5 to 3 million people coming from around the world. They create this absolute rubbish booking system. It took us 14 hours to actually book our package. And even then, subhanAllah, man. So I transferred money, right? Transferred money to pay for Hajj, only for them to say that it's not being accepted, right? And then, there was an option of cash deposit and card deposit. So there's some people that wanted to pay the money by cash. And on the website, on the Saudi portal, there were a number of different cash deposit places. And wallah al-azim, people went there and it was construction sites. There was nobody there, right? It's crazy. So you're talking about, so the point that I'm trying to illustrate is that just because you've got money and just because you've got big buildings doesn't make you an elevated people. Doesn't make you an elevated or productive nation, right? But human beings seek productivity. We want productivity. We want improvement. We want to progress in our life, right? And the reality is that if you want some of those things in the Muslim world, right, you have to pay the premium to live in places like this, where you're surrounded by Westerners, right? You probably never need to step into mainland of those countries because you're living in a bubble. So these places are not an actual representation of the wider society, right? So this is Barrier Town just outside of Lahore and Karachi, etc., etc. It's a different world, right? It's like a completely different planet, right? You'll find Kellogg's cereal and stuff like that there, right? But you won't find that you won't find that in the mainland, right? It's the same in Qatar. So despite how beautiful they look, they're not productive, right? Which is why Muslims still come back to the West, right? Despite wanting to spend some time in the Middle East. Yeah. So when Muslims did come to the West, this is our fathers and grandfathers and grandparents, they had to think about what their problems were. What are the immediate challenges we face, right? And the mentality at that time was survival, which only makes sense, right? Muslims had to find halal food. Muslims had to ensure that there were places of worship. Muslims had to ensure that there were people that could adjudicate marriages, as an example. Muslims had to find, burial services. They had to make sure that there were places that they can bury their dead and washing the body in janazah, etc., etc. So the first generation of Muslims who came to the West, right, focused their activity, focused their activism, focused their organization on issues of survival, right? Which was, of course, linked to Islam, right? Which is why they built all of these different things, right? And that was the right thing to do, because without those things we wouldn't be able to complete the necessities of our deen. However, because the early generation and even the second generation, which I'll explain, didn't understand the landscape of the West, right? Which I explained in a few slides before. This defined their approach in the first instance. So the Muslim community felt that isolating themselves from the rest of the West or the rest of the communities was the best way to go. Right? So they came to the country, they ensured the issues of survival, and they felt, our fathers, grandfathers, etc., felt that, okay, look, we're here, we're living in, whether it's Bradford, whether it's Rochdale, whether it's Oldham, whether it's wherever these places are, East London, Whitechapel, etc., we can just keep ourselves isolated, right? We can keep ourselves isolated. We don't necessarily need to involve ourselves with anybody else, especially, the white man, right? That's how it was, right? And as a result of that, we segregated ourselves. Largely speaking, we segregated ourselves. By the way, if you guys disagree with me, let me know, yeah? But be open. It's an open discussion, inshallah. But we segregated ourselves, right? We decided that actually remaining apolitical or disengaged with the political context of Britain and even our countries back home was the best way to go about and organize ourselves. Bury your head in the sand approach, right? Bury your head in the sand. So therefore, we read the struggle of today like this as well, right? So for instance, we felt that, okay, the biggest threat to Islam from an ideological basis is Christianity. So it was during the 80s, you had personalities like Ahmed Deedat. Does anybody know Ahmed Deedat? Yeah. Ahmed Deedat and other personalities that went into kind of biblical criticism. Because for the Muslims, they felt that Christianity was the biggest threat. And also part of this isolating kind of, approach was that you're going to reject anything that comes from the West or reject the West as an entirety. Now, they didn't really migrate to communist lands, even though, like for example, I've got relatives who actually studied in Russia, right? Does anybody have any relatives, uncles, aunties that studied in Russia, right? So because part of the lure, there's obviously a competition between the West and the East, the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc, and both were trying to explain how and demonstrate how their ways of life was superior to the other. So actually Muslims went to communist Russia and communist lands in order to study disciplines like engineering, medicine, etc., right? But they didn't stay there. Does anybody know why they didn't stay there?
Fundamentally, those lands aren't very open and accepting.
Yeah. Because in communism, they believe that, the philosophers of communism believe that religion is the opium of masses, right? It's completely to be discarded because they're materialists, yeah? 2 minutes. So, and then basically, is it a question or is it?
Was that Karl Marx who said?
Correct. So essentially as a result of that, Muslims felt, okay, we can't settle here because these guys just fundamentally don't like religion. So they decided to stay in the West because, of course, as part of liberal philosophy, there is something called freedom of religion. We're going to talk about that a little bit in a second. It's freedom in speech marks, right? So they felt that, okay, we were coming into a neutral space where we as Muslims will be able to establish our community. We as Muslims will be able to have our masajid, have our educational institutions without any political repercussion or any repercussion at all, right? And ultimately, a lot of this was as a result of a very narrow understanding of Islam, right? It's a bold statement to make, and that's not the fault of our forefathers. It was the fact that they lived under colonial enterprises for 200 years, right? And a truer understanding of Islam was forcefully withered away from them, right? Many of the movements that you see, for example, that came from the Muslim world today that are apolitical, became apolitical, or that really detached themselves from the affairs of society, became such because of the intense pressure that the British and the French, etc., put on Muslim communities in their host nations, right? In those nations, like Algeria, for example, and in India and Pakistan, for instance, right? So over 200 years, there was a withering away of a very true and comprehensive understanding of Islam. So we were left with a very narrow view on what Islam is and how Islam can contribute to the development of mankind. So from one angle, we were this, but our ancestors came and they wanted it all though. They wanted to get educated, they wanted to have a job, they wanted their children to earn a degree, and and these are true stories, they came across British women, they got married to British women, they started to drink alcohol, yeah? Like early Muslim communities started to proper drink alcohol. Of course, Muslim women wanted to work, they started to enter the workplace, etc., etc., get educated, etc. However, it was ignoring, and I'm not saying any of those things are wrong, by the way, but it was done through ignoring what the reality of the West was and the culture of the West, right? You're trying to take take from the fruit without understanding really the root, right? And that was the problem. So we started to run into problems, right? Which we still run into today, brothers and sisters, yeah? So what are we? Or who are we? Are we Muslim? Right? Are we British? Are we Arab or Pakistani? Right? Or Indian? Or, let's go further. Are we Tunisian? Are we Egyptian? Are we Punjabi? Etc. Are we right-leaning? We'll talk about this in a little bit. Are we right-leaning in terms of our politics? Are we left-leaning in terms of our politics? Are we extremists? Right? Or are we, or do we identify based on our career? Right? Engineer, doctor, accountant, whatever it may be. Teacher. Are we feminists? Right? Or chauvinists? Right? They're both problematic. Are we liberal progressive? Right? Are we moderates? Are we traditionalists? We run into a quagmire of problems when it comes to understanding who we are, right? In terms of understanding our identities. And the sad thing is that in the 40, 50, 60 years that Muslim communities from back home, first generation, second generation, we're now third, fourth generation, I would say that unfortunately our approach towards our life as minorities within the West is much the same. So 30% of Muslims voted for Brexit, right? This is latest stat, yeah? 30% of Muslims voted for Brexit, which is so ironic, right? The irony is that Rishi Sunak, subhanAllah, is deporting people to Rwanda. So Rishi Sunak, who is an immigrant himself in origin, is now deporting people to Rwanda, right? Despite him in origin being an immigrant, right? But 30% of Muslims voted for Brexit, right? And it was like, why are you voting for Brexit? And it's, oh yeah, these people are stealing our jobs. And it's like, la hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. But, 71% of Muslims vote Labour, right? That's pretty well known. The reason cited from a lot of these stats from the Muslim census, which is a website, and also from the latest actual national census. State benefits and taxes are the main reasons why people vote Labour. In 2017, there are now 1,825 mosques, right? It's really weird, yeah, in Leeds, yeah? Rehan, you know what I'm talking about, right? But like you've got, for example, there's a masjid, yeah, in a place called Chapel Town. And it's like, It's like the main Islamic center, right? One of the bigger Islamic centers. And literally like a minute walk down the road, they're building another masjid. When I say a minute down the road, because I work in the area, right? And you're just walking a minute and there's a masjid. And I'm like, why is there a need for another masjid when you've just got one here? And it's a big masjid, by the way, yeah? It hosts a lot of people. The government announced £2.2 million worth of funding to a youth club of a Birmingham mosque. I'm not going to mention the masjid, right? So the Birmingham masjid took £2.2 million from the British government for youth activity, right? And it was now halted, by the way, because some videos of some of the imams got released, etc., of them saying certain things, and it's now been halted. The point that I'm trying to make about all of these different things is that survival is still the paradigm of Muslim communities today, right? We haven't moved on as minorities, right? Our ancestors came as, you know, with the mindset of making buck, going back home, surviving, building the institutions that are integral to our survival, and 50 to 60 years on, our mindset is very, very similar, right? You know, we're still looking at political issues from the point of view of how does it benefit or harm me, right? Our decision to vote is not necessarily about foreign policy. It's not about Muslim experiences. It's about how much money am I going to be left in my pocket, right? And we're still building mosques, alhamdulillah, but we're still getting lots of funding from the government. And a lot of that funding has always come back to stab us in the back, unfortunately. And I'll talk about some of those examples, right? That funding is not like, here, take some money. It's got a number of different conditions attached. But we haven't learned. Now, the second generation was a bit different. So I'm second generation, yeah, but it might be many of your parents, as an example, who might have been born here. So the considerations may have changed from survival to trying to consolidate, because the second generation now understood that, look, we're here to stay now. We're not going to go back to our countries. So we've got to create some form of future for Muslims here, right? We want to create some form of future for Muslims. So things evolved, right? So we started to be given citizenship rights, right? So Muslims started to purchase property within the West, right? Muslims entered the workplace, right? Men and women, as an example, right? Popular culture, we're now watching all of the TV shows and movies, right? The masajid are built, but we're also producing lots of hufad of Quran, and, you know, when the adhan is out loud, it's a victory for us, right? When we have, for example, iftar at Downing Street, it's a victory for us, yeah? We can wear a thobe at university, or at, you know, in some places in the workplace, right? Second generation, third generation Muslims, their aspirations have changed, right? It's not necessarily about making hufad of Quran or whatever it may be, or preserving the integrity of your language or your culture. It's more about having a nice car and a nice house and, you know, having multiple children and living a very, very nice and rosy life. I'm not saying there's a problem with these things. I'm just saying that there's an evolution. Our value structure has changed, all right? We've got breakdown of families, right? We've got chauvinism, feminism, liberalism, LGBTQ. There's loads of different things. And really what had happened was, or what has happened from my take, is that Islam and Muslims have really become redefined, right? Because we took a lot of things for granted and our mentality has not evolved, the reality is that our Islam is withering away, right? And has withered away. Just some anecdotal examples, and I really want to explain some of these examples, right? Like, even, for example, religious fatawa, right? Getting a ruling. So when we want a ruling for something, the arbitrator, when it comes to something that's halal and haram, has to be the nas, or the text, right? Or the Quran and the Sunnah and Ijma' Sahaba, Qiyas, etc. What is said in those, right? But you can potentially obtain a fatwa for most things, right? For most things. And here are some examples, right? So, selling alcohol in supermarket, right? Taking out a mortgage, eating McDonald's because it's, Ahl Kitab. There's loads of different things, right? All of those fatwas would never have been allowed in any other context, but they've become the norm, right? Because we are trying our best to integrate. Why are we trying to integrate, or why are we trying to do that? It's because we're trying to obtain the fruits of the Western civilization, right? We are trying to obtain progress. We are trying to have our problems solved. We are trying to be educated. We're trying to obtain the material benefits. But at what cost is probably the question to ask. For many of us, we considered, and we continue to consider, liberalism and Western liberalism to be what we call ideologically neutral, right? But it's not ideologically neutral, and we'll come to explain why that's not the case, right? But Islam and Muslims have become a cog in the wheel, and Islam has become redefined. These are two pictures that actually tell a very similar story, right? This is Joe Biden, and this is some random person in hijab. At the moment, there's obviously a massacre that's taking place in Gaza. And in international politics, there's a lot of discussion about what actually the United States of America stands for. Because the United States of America has perhaps contravened a lot of the, some of the values that it has always kind of stood up on, right? Whether it's human rights, whether it's liberty, whether it's freedom, etc. That's pretty normal for the United States of America to do historically, right? Just recently, there's a chap that died. His name was Henry Kissinger, right? And Kissinger defined that. It's called realpolitik. Essentially, it means that it doesn't matter what your values are, you can compromise your values when it comes to political interests. However, when it comes to the rest of the world, everybody is now thinking, okay, what does the UN stand for then? What does the International Court of Justice stand for, as the ICJ stand for? What does the United States of America stand for? In other words, there's a loss of identity and meaning on the part of the United States. In the same respect, there's a loss of identity, big statement, loss of identity and meaning when it comes to hijab, right? Because it's not claimed, the narrative is not claimed by us. The narrative is claimed by Chanel. The narrative is claimed by L'Oreal. The narrative is claimed by Western multinational companies, right? We are withering, right? Our identity is withering. And it's to do with a lot of different things, not just hijab, it's a lot of different Islamic aspects. So there's a lot of commonality between the US today and Muslims. So, transitioning on very quickly. So first and second generation felt, look, we've come, we're going to take all of the benefits, right? Whether it's, the education, the work, the opportunity, the finance, etc. Right? And okay, maybe people that are older than me, and there are, were probably telling the Muslim community that, look, this comes at an expense, guys, right? This comes at an expense. But our discussions, and discussions like this, by the way, believe it or not, in the 90s, in the early 2000s, were completely shut down. They were shut down from masajid, they were shut down from Muslim forums, because statements such as, Islam doesn't have politics, there is no politics in Islam, these things don't concern us, we need to just protect ourselves, we need to concern ourselves with establishing salah. These were all in the minds of Muslims justifications for not, talking about the wider social political issues. But now, there's a crackdown, right? Now there's a crackdown, right? And it's not the fact that, the government changed and that's why there's a crackdown. It's because ideologically, right? Ideologically, there was always going to be a crackdown. It was just waiting as to when that was going to happen, right? So from one hand, you had Muslims trying to shut down productive conversation about the role of Islam in the West, right? About what da'wah looks like, about how even Islamic societies, how they need to function as an example, about policies and government policies, about foreign policy considerations. So Muslims were being told by other Muslims that we're apolitical, right? That we just want to keep Islam to the culture and the cultural space, right? A very insular approach. Now what you're seeing is that approach has completely backfired, and the government is cracking down massively on Muslim discussions and Muslim spaces, and that's the generation that we live in. So in 2011 in Munich, David Cameron gave a speech. It was in the security conference, the Munich Security Conference. And in that speech he said, multiculturalism has failed, right? Multiculturalism has failed, right? Does anybody know what multiculturalism is in a political UK context?
Different cultures coexisting in their true form.
Absolutely, right? And a lot of the isolationism and the fact that we don't really need to deal with anybody else aside from ourselves, and the insular nature that Muslims had, that was lended to by a policy called multiculturalism, right? That you can have your own communities, you know, if you're Hindu, Sikh or Muslim or whatever you may be, you just exist in your enclave, and that's about it, to be honest, right? Sorry.
During this time, didn't the Tories also have a Muslim MP or candidate during this time? I believe when this speech was given.
I'm not sure. In
Like when he was Prime Minister, I believe there was an MP.
Warsi, Saeeda Warsi.
I believe it was a woman.
Yeah, Saeeda Warsi, who left. Is that the same lady?
Yeah, and then she came
Yeah,
out recently. She was like basically flaving.
Yeah. So Saeeda Warsi was a baroness, if anybody knows that. She's actually from York. I've seen her plenty of times. Ironically in an outlet store there. But anyway, I never said hi though. I was just, browsing. But anyway, so yeah, she left actually the Conservative Party during this time, right? But it's specifically about the Palestinian issue, which is why she left. Which is good. However, things changed drastically for the Muslims. It changed prior to this. This just made it official. Because multiculturalism was a policy that allowed Muslims to just exist in their enclaves. The policy changed in 2011 to something called integration, right? Integration essentially meant that Muslim communities, as well as other communities, but ultimately it was Muslim communities, needed to be policed and integrated into what you would call a British value structure, right? And it was off the back of this, you saw a massive intensification of policies like Prevent, of countering terrorism and security as an example, and a lot of different things that we're going to talk about now. And really, that created a massive shock in the Muslims. The reality is that this was always going to happen. Because without getting into the detail, with liberalism, or liberal philosophy as an example, yes, it holds this idea about freedom of religion, right? It's called moral arbitrarism, which essentially says that, look, you can be Christian, you can be Jewish, you can be Muslim, you can be Hindu, etc., etc. All of them are irrelevant anyway, right? But the minute one starts to, manifest in society, the minute one starts to dictate their morality in accordance to a religious code, the minute one starts to have certain, allegiances outside of the state, outside of the nation state, right? Either with a religion or another state, whatever it may be, then that's when a crackdown happens, right? That's when a crackdown happens. So this was always embedded in liberal philosophy anyway. It was just manifested in a great severity in 2011. So you had a massive onslaught. You had war on terror, which was before that. You had this whole idea about who an extremist Muslim is and who an extremist Muslim isn't. And this was the policy of integration. And here are some examples of what that led to. So the first is something called Operation Trojan Horse, right? So I explained Operation Trojan Horse. earlier. This is a podcast called The Trojan Horse Affair, which is a brilliant podcast. Has anybody heard of Serial? Podcast? That's a brilliant podcast, by the way. As in, like, I got to know about it because they had their first. So basically, they're investigative journalists, right? And they reopen cases, and they look into the nitty-gritty of the case to work out whether the outcome of the case was correct or whether it wasn't. The first one was about this guy called Adnan Saeed, who was accused of killing this girl in the USA. The result of that podcast was that the case was reopened, right? And Adnan was released, right? Although now there's another case put on him. So the same company did the same thing on what is called Operation Trojan Horse, right? So this is Tahir Alam. He is a resident of Birmingham, and he was a governor in a school which was called Parkview Academy in one of the most deprived areas of Birmingham. He was a passionate educationalist, right? He believed that Muslim students need to be educated, and he worked very hard in a voluntary capacity in order to try and fix the schools, right? And he did that top down. So he tried to create schools that had a serious attitude towards education. And actually, his schools ended up becoming rated as outstanding by Ofsted, right? So Ofsted actually rated the schools that he was in charge of and his committee was in charge of as outstanding. All of a sudden, in 2014, you have a random letter that was sent by somebody we still don't know to Birmingham City Council. And this letter basically said that there is an extremist plot that's happening, right? So Tahir Alam is apparently the head of an extremist plot that is there to radicalize students in schools in Birmingham and Bradford, right? And then it mentions a number of names and it mentions a number of different schools. And this letter started to do the rounds. Now, this letter was leaked to the press, and actually an investigation was launched into the origins of this letter. And despite the official reports, there were two reports, concluding that this letter was fabricated, right? And also concluding that there was no evidence of any Islamicization of students at these schools, right? They said that there is a concern that teachers are not doing enough to challenge it. That's enough to basically say that, you know, we're going to completely change the landscape of how schools operate, or faith-based schools operate in the UK. Michael Gove, as an example, who was the education secretary from what I remember at that time, held it up in Parliament and said, look, this is the evidence behind, you know, religious extremism or Islamic extremism in schools, right? So he actually held it up in Parliament, right? And you had a number of random Ofsted inspections that happened as a result of this, and this same school has now gone completely downhill. It went from having like a 5 to 10% pass rate at GCSE, maybe something along that, 15% or something, to having like over 90% under Tahir Alam, and now it's gone back to just a bit above what it used to be. All of these teachers who dedicated their life to teaching students, particularly, you know, in the area that they grew up on, they could have gone away and they could have like lived in other places and maybe made a career for themselves in Qatar or Kuwait or whatever, but they stayed in Birmingham because they wanted to, you know, help the Muslims. None of them can. Many of them can't teach anymore. Many of them had severe mental health problems as a result of this inquisition that happened, right? But this completely changed the landscape of faith-based schooling. So what do I mean by that? So faith-based schooling is now, for example, a very different space, right? So, for instance, there's a school in Birmingham, in Blackburn, that actually invited a delegation from Israel, right? And basically for them to explain the Israeli perspective on the Palestinian issue, right? I think that maybe some people remember that, yeah? For example, the teaching of certain un-Islamic ideas, right, pertaining to, you know, things like sexuality, etc., are pretty much mainstream in faith-based schooling, right? This is all as a result of this. Then you have Prevent, No, I won't ask that question. I was going to ask if anybody has been. Yeah, I have, really?
Well, they tried to.
Right. All right, okay.
It was a misunderstanding. But,
yeah, fair enough. No, I've had a fair few run-ins at university, right? So have my friends, they've been in London Underground and approached by random people to say, oh yeah, this is your name. I'd like to have a chat with you about this, right? And obviously they didn't entertain the conversation. But these are real instances. So Prevent was introduced by Labour, right? By the Labour government. And it was introduced in 2003 as part of the government's 4P strategy. So it's Prevent, Pursue, Protect and Prepare. And it's all about de-radicalization, right? Of people. The reality is that whilst it is advertised, so this is an old stat, 44%, but whilst it is advertised as kind of being for the far right and also for Muslims, it was overwhelmingly for Muslim referrals, right? And that's known. And now you're going to see it even more, which I'll explain why. As part of Prevent, funding was extended to loads of Muslims, organizations, right? Masajid, youth clubs, they took so much funding from Prevent, right? Even though they didn't see the fact that, like I said, subhanAllah, it's actually very primitive. Yeah, it's a really strong word to use. It's very primitive, to be taking like funding for free without realizing that there are conditions that are attached to this funding, right? It is, things like this destroy the fabric of Muslim communities, right? And to be honest, we don't need funding anymore, but I'll explain that anyway. We have plenty of entrepreneurs within our communities. We have plenty of people. We just need to reach them better, right? Masajid need to be able to reach out to people that aren't part of their congregation, right? Not doing that is a failure on their part, right? So now, teachers, GPs, doctors, everybody is under legal obligation to refer people to Prevent, right? If they feel that there is a problem with regards to their behavior, right? And then if, for example, after Prevent, there's actually, they find that there's a problem, they then refer them to something called Channel, right? Channel is an actual de-radicalization program. So you have to go to classes and they tell you about different things apparently. And the vast majority of people that get referred to Prevent are not referred to Channel. But you might see it as just a referral, somebody comes to your house and that's about it. But these things scar people. Yeah, Muslims are scarred, right? There's a sister who's done some brilliant work. She's part of something called the People's Review of Prevent. Her name is Layla something. But she's brilliant, right? She's on YouTube, etc. But she talks quite extensively about Prevent and the repercussions of Prevent, right? In 2023, in this year, there was a report on Prevent. It was supposed to be an independent report on Prevent about whether Prevent works, whether it doesn't. And actually what it says was that there is no evidence that Prevent works, but we need more Prevent. That was the conclusion. He actually said, William Shawcross, he actually says we need to actually defocus from far right organizations. Because a lot of the narrative that you see from far right organizations is actually quite similar to mainstream politics, right? When politicians talk about things like immigration, when they talk about, for example, things like Muslims or people like Muslims, or when they talk about minority communities, there's actually a very fine line between the types of things that they're saying and what far-right organizations say, right? It's just like saying deportation, but in a different way, right? Or stopping immigration, or eroding of our cultural values, but they just say it in a nicer way. So William Shawcross obviously caught onto this and said we need to defocus policy from far-right organizations and we need to refocus on Islam. In addition to that, his report says we need to start to ban and curb Muslim-led civil society organizations. So charities, right? NGOs, right? Youth clubs, youth centers. So they actually need to start to police them, close them down, question their funding. about 3 years ago, for example, there were a number of accounts of Muslim charities that were just arbitrarily closed, right? Completely closed. HSBC and a few other banks, closed them. That was essentially on the imperative of the government, right? But it was justified according to Prevent. The science behind Prevent is questionable, because the science holds is that if you have certain values, and those values are very simple values, such as, for example, you believe that your morality comes from your religious tradition, you believe that Islam has a view on all aspects of life, you believe that Islam is the truth with a capital T, which I think every Muslim should believe in, right, and does believe in. These things are held as values of extremism, right? So it's a very dangerous space, right? It's a very troublesome and dangerous space. And for many of the people that are referred, their lives are made into misery, right? Even if you don't get referred to Prevent, but you're visited, that stays on your record, right? So when you are employed, when you go for an interview, whatever it may be, things like that are there. Now, is this policy about changing Islam? I don't think so, right? Is this policy about silencing Muslim voices? I definitely think so, right? It's not about changing the Islamic basis. It's about silencing any form of political dissent or political activism, right, from the Muslims. Another example, just going across the pond to France. There used to be, where I grew up in East London, and there's a big Algerian population, right? Massive Algerian population. Like most of the Muslims, a lot of the Muslims that I went to school with were Algerians, right? Algies, so we used to call them, right? Algies. So, and you know what? They used to say, interestingly, so their dads used to tell my dad that, alhamdulillah, Britain is so much better than France, right? Alhamdulillah, Britain is so much better than France. So they actually came from Algeria to France, and they fled France to come to Britain. That's how it was, right? Now what's interesting, I believe that gulf is narrowing, right? That gulf of difference there used to be from a Muslim experience in France and in Britain is narrowing, right? It's just that the French are more severe in their secularism, right? Because France is the birth child of liberalism, right? Of fraternity, of freedom, of liberalism. And actually, there's a famous saying that the French say, that the religion of the Frenchman is to be religionless, right? The religion of the Frenchman is to be religionless, right? When you manifest, for the French person, as an example, because of their experiences and the character of secularism or liberalism they adopted as a society, they react a lot stronger to any expression of religion or religious identity in the public life. Think about the burkini ban. Think about, for example, women wearing hijab, and even women wearing hijab and going to school, as an example, and colleges, which was the latest ban, as an example. It's a lot more severe. That's because of their expression of secularism and liberalism. So systematic obstruction is an actual policy coined by the French government, right? So in July 2021, there was an anti-separatism bill, which was about this, once again, the threat of Islamicization within certain segments of French society, right? That led to a policy of systematic obstruction, right? As a result of systematic obstruction until now, the French government has placed 23,996 Muslim organizations on a watch list. 672 Muslim-owned organizations were closed, including 37 mosques in France. 45 million euros were just taken. They don't need to give a justification in France. Under the anti-separatism bill, they can just take. The French police can arbitrarily just detain you if you just look weird. And that's what happened with Nahil Marzouk. Does anybody know about this case in 2023? Yeah? What happened?
An Algerian teenager was killed when he was in his car. I
Bismillah.
don't remember what reason they used, but yeah.
Well, that was the accusation. The accusation was that he was being violent, right? And he was trying to drive off, right? The videos that were taken at that time didn't show any of that. They literally just shot him.
Isn't France known for having a culture of just accepted police brutality?
Yeah, but it doesn't justify it, right?
No, but it's like...
It happens.
Yeah.
Yeah, it happens. But what's interesting was that this wasn't the first time Nahil was stopped. Like for the Muslim in France, arbitrary searches can be pretty normal in certain areas because the police have these powers, right? So you've got a very, very difficult circumstance, not only in France, but also one developing in the West, in the UK. And I haven't even touched on America, by the way, right? That's a different discussion for a different time. So what is the net result of all of this? What is the net result of the fact that our approach has not changed? The fact that we are still in survival mode? The fact that we still, and some segments of our community, don't feel that we need to actually organize ourselves and express ourselves as Muslims, right? So we have conflicting identities and loyalties, yeah? You know, Muslim parents, they fear for their kids, right? In the West, they really do fear for their kids, yeah? How is my kid going to turn out, right? Because the amount of policing that happens in in school is even worse, right? Prevent referrals of children as young as 7, right? And 8 years old, drawing pictures as an example. We have a fear of being labelled. There is this constant need of wanting to be accepted within our societies. Some of us self-loathe, right? Some of us are like, we need to change our Islam. And why don't you change your Islam? People still have quite localized and narrow thinking. It's still about, how much money is left in my pocket. It's still about local interest versus the wider Muslim world. We're still trying to work out what our role is in the West. Are we just really here? Are we here just to get some money and get educated and that's about it? Or do we have a further contribution to give to the wider society? And we are being forced in a corner. And some of us have made kind of the decision, or some will hold that, okay, we need to politically express ourselves, right? Before, it used to be between democracy and socialism, and now, in a domestic political situation, it's right and left, right? Right is nationalistic policies, hardcore nationalism, hard rule, and left is kind of liberal policies, right? More freedom and yeah, etc. But we can unpack that a little bit more. Muslim MPs are wondering, okay, what are we talking about? Are we prioritizing domestic versus foreign policy considerations? And we can see that with the Palestinian issue today, right? When you look at how the Muslim MPs have voted concerning a ceasefire, it's utterly disappointing, right? So those MPs that got the Muslim vote on the promise that we're here to help the Muslims, we're here to help you, we're here to benefit you, are not representing the Muslim voice, right? Now there's a very interesting, what Mikhail recited in Quran today, right? About the story of Musa alayhi salam. It's really powerful, right? With Musa alayhi salam, or with Fir'aun, right? There are 3 entities that are mentioned in terms of that is the establishment which constituted pharaonic rule. One is Pharaoh himself, Fir'aun, right? What was Fir'aun's claim? Sorry?
He was God.
Yeah, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la. So he said, Ana Rabbukum al-A'la, I am your Lord Most High. And then he had an institution which was called Haman, right? So Haman was an institution, right? It was his advisors, right? He constituted his advisory council. And often he would seek counsel from Haman. But there was a third entity. Does anybody know who that entity was? Qarun. Qarun was the third entity. Does anybody know who Qarun was? Somebody else? I'll go for him, okay.
Like the treasurer, the chancellor.
Yeah, but does anybody know where Qarun came from?
The people themselves.
Qarun was from Banu Israel. Qarun was from the people, he was Moses' cousin. He was Musa alayhi salam's cousin. Right? And Allah says that we gave him wealth, we gave him a position, we gave him, he was the counselor, one of the main councils to Pharaoh. So he was part of the oppressed class, but he was given a higher political position. But Allah says that he's cursed. Right? That he's cursed. He destroyed himself. Allah says that he destroyed himself. Right? Because he didn't do anything that was for the benefit of Banu Israel. Right? He actually started to self-loathe his people. He actually felt that he was beyond and better than his people now that he was with Pharaoh. He provided no good to the Muslims or Banu Israel at that time. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala curses him. So there's a lot of lessons to be taken. Right? And is the ballot box the extent of Muslim political activity? Is our only contribution in terms of creating a voice as Muslims just to go and put a ticket into the ballot box? Is that all we're reduced to? So here's the way forward. Ultimately, if you stand for nothing, you fall for anything. And I believe I've tried to illustrate the fact that we are falling for anything. Those things and even those symbols that we claim, right? Whether it's, Quran, Salah, hijab, our voice, are being claimed by other people. We ourselves are being categorized and subcategorized on the terms of other people, right? Some of them are extremists. It's not defined by Muslims, it's defined by the liberal authority about who an extremist is and who isn't an extremist, who a traditionalist is and who isn't a traditionalist. There is a need to build an authentic Islamic identity that's comprehensive. We need to think beyond building a masjid. We need to think beyond, having halal meat. We need to think beyond a lot of these different things. Our da'wah to Islam also has to take into account the context. The greatest threat to Islam is not Christianity. Our forefathers felt that, our parents and our grandparents, and they may still say that. It was never Christianity. It was always secularism. It was always liberalism. In fact, you know what? They're all the same. Whether it's communism, whether it's liberalism, whether it's Zoroastrianism, whether it's Christianity, because all of them say the same thing when you whittle it down. They all say that man is sovereign over his own affairs. That's what they all say. That man is the best entity, man's interpretation is the best entity to decide how man should live. It's only Islam that says, actually, it's Allah's word that determines how best to live. We got to define our organization as a community, our activism as a community. And there are some questions that Muslims ask. Will hijrah to Muslim land solve our problems? I would say no. I don't believe so. Right? That's personally speaking. And we can unpack that. Many of us, our forefathers and us, remain in the UK because of the productivity that a civilization provides. Our lands are not civilizations. Our lands are lands that have struck gold through oil and have built massive buildings and enterprises. Right? That's not productivity. That's just outsourcing. local politics, do we support independence? Do we actually think about civil disobedience? Right? Is that the way we get our voice heard as Muslims? Right? These are conversations that Muslims are having, right? As minorities that are largely on the back foot, misrepresented in the West. So I hope that provides some form of context. And ultimately, and I leave on this note, the pursuit of Muslims to come to the West was a pursuit of a civilization. The pursuit of progress, the pursuit of wealth, the pursuit of food, the pursuit of good shelter, the pursuit of having their problems solved. The problem that we face is that for those who are sincere, when we come to the West, we ultimately live in societies that from their basis and from their culture are in contradiction to our value structure. Right? Fundamentally, liberal societies hold that man is sovereign over all your affairs. Religion and life should be separated. Fundamentally, Islam holds that religion and life are one. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, the independent entity. He's al-alimul ghaybi was samawati wal ard. He's the one who knows everything. And he has determined the best way we live our lives. And he's done that through, the law, the sharia. So ultimately, we are, as Muslims, find ourselves, wherever we are, in very unnatural habitats that are not in tandem with our view on life. Right? So even we, as people, me and you, who find it sometimes difficult with regards to issues that are around us, whether it's expression, whether it's the comfortability of wearing hijab and Islamic dress, or even a thobe and expressing our Islam, that uncomfortability is for no other reason aside from the fact that we are in an unnatural habitat. Right? But our heritage is that we have always lived in societies that were a reflection of our culture. And these are pictures that explain this, right? That is Masjid al-Aqsa, right? Think about the effect adhan out loud has on you guys, right? Think about the sakina that you get when the adhan is out loud. You may not want to pray, but when you hear the adhan, when you look at the social fabric of society, where everybody is closing their shop in order to pray salah, even this person who doesn't really want to pray ends up praying. Right? Because that is natural to us. That condition is natural to us. Right? So if you take that one anecdotal example of the effect that it has, what we seek really is to live in a society that is most representative of that. And the question remains as to whether we get there or not. قولوا قولي هذا واستغفر الله ولكم ولسائر المسلمين فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. Any questions or comments? Bismillah.